We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gushel.
This is one of those weeks where there's a lot that we're trying to make sense of regarding this recent story with this that is basically just taken over Washington, D.C. that is over the last week, and that is this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. If some of the Democrats are serious, this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back that really begins to start ramping up an actual real effort for if not an outright impeachment in terms of actually getting the president out of the White House, but at the very least maybe some accountability at some level. Or I don't put my hopes up, but this could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and there could be some changes in the the DC landscape as a result of this. Of course, that's a big if. I mean, we know that the Pelosi Democratic leadership is very iffy at best on any of this kind of stuff, because a lot of times these same people are very much up to their eyeballs in a lot of the same kind of corruption. But I mean, we'll see how this plays out. But right now, we're just trying to make some sense of some of this recent news. And I guess what we'll try to do today is we'll do more of a little more of a deep dive. I think this is going to be a reading heavy episode where we're going to I think, Jeremy, you have some articles and some publications, a few books to read from, and as we go on, I'll comment on things at various points in the show. But before we really get into this, what are your initial thoughts coming of this last week's worth of stories that we admit we haven't even begun to really start to make sense of, with all the people and all the connections? But what we do know is that very much there's a very false narrative going out as far as once again, this isn't even to count the other side, so to speak, but once again, a very false at best narrative is coming out of the pro-Trump wing of media commentators and frontmen and up to their eyeballs frontmen like Rudy Giuliani. So what are your initial thoughts of all of this?
It does seem like a moment of raw opening of some sort, while also it's very clear that this whistleblower document is very highly planned and very well orchestrated at some level. And if there were something like what might be called a counter coup, a deep state counter coup, this would obviously be it. And so there's a lot of interest in the midst of this chaotic fray too, which includes some of the ones that you mentioned in terms of aspects of the Democratic establishment that have been, it seems like they've been actually trying to hold back. And this includes aspects of the media that represents this part of the Democratic establishment that is very much, I believe, not only concerned about their own potential corruption and compromise, but also in containing this question of Trump's corruption to the East, and not to connect it to the Israel connection. And I think that's what we're also going to see in relationship to this. The word is out that in terms of Nancy Pelosi, it seems like she's trying to drive this in a very focused fashion, this impeachment inquiry, towards really honed in almost completely just around this Ukraine question and the Trump phone call. But meanwhile, it's already popping up that there's other phone calls. The records of these other phone calls have been put, it looks like, improperly on an air-gapped national security server, and utilizing this idea of national security to cover up for potential questions and transparency in relationship to corruption. And that is very plain. And of course, this is something that we know, that since the advent and the rise of the national security state, the National Security Act, the Central Intelligence Agency, the intense secrecy overlay umbrella to the large aspects of the entirety of the national security apparatus that goes hand in hand with the blackest of operations that includes high level deception, combined with things like the staging of events or the staging of terrorism or the staging of assassinations, and that often this is how national security secrets have been utilized, is to cover up things that are inherently corrupt, unconstitutional, illegal, immoral. But this is so blatant and already out there that it's going to be difficult to contain it. And so it's already becoming up that other conversations that Trump had that are closer to the Middle East, for example, with Saudi Arabia, conversations, it looks like with Mohammed bin Salman, that these conversations, I believe their transcripts, have been put on these air-gapped national security servers to try to cover it up, really. And of course, the infamous Putin conversations, whether Helsinki or other ones, are also there in terms of notes or transcripts, we might imagine. But meanwhile, this Middle Eastern connection, as people from Seth Abramson, in terms of his book Proof of Conspiracy, to many others, traces largely back to Netanyahu and the Israel connection here, and the long-term geopolitical strategies of this aspect of the Israeli national security state. And what just popped in my mind, so that we don't forget about this, is that there's still this Epstein question still hanging in the background, although large portions of the media have just sort of pretended like it never happened. Meanwhile, Zev Shalev, the Israeli-born, actually, former CBS News executive producer, and I believe award-winning producer, has continued some of his own investigations into this, and we've talked about, and it is interesting. Let's reference back to when we were at the Iowa State Fair, Greg, and it was during the press conference after Senator Cory Booker's stump speech at the Iowa State Fair, where I was interjecting a question about Epstein and Israeli intelligence, when this woman next to us, and we've told this story before, she interjected and started basically calling. She said, of course he's not going to respond to you. It's absurd what you're saying. And I can't remember what else she said, but I was pointing out to her that Zev Shalev, this former executive producer of CBS News, had come on the record and reported that that he had multiple sources, that Epstein was Israeli military intelligence, that Epstein was working with Israeli military intelligence. Okay, that is a big, of course, when you add that to the historical and contextual and open source data that Whitney Webb tracked down on the Epstein network and the background of it and the decades-long aspect of it, and then brought it into the current moment in relationship to Israeli military technology and the Carbine 911. And this is, of course, where the investigations of Whitney Webb and the Zev Shalev narrative begin to come together in relationship to high technology, Carbine 911, right? And so this is a big, big deal, right? And this should be being talked about, that a former executive producer of CBS News has confirmed with multiple sources that Epstein was Israeli military intelligence. And he has now said that one of those sources, and has done a follow-up a little bit with this source, is Ari Ben Menashe, who is, who in terms of some of the information that gets put out, that he puts out, there are of course questions about it. He's an Israeli intelligence guy, but he also has put out very interesting information that needs to be dealt with. So this is continued, and Zev Shalev has reported that Ari Ben Menashe actually had met Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell back in the 80s, And this, of course, throws the whole mainstream timeline off, where they try to put it to the early 90s when Ghislaine Maxwell first met Epstein in New York City. But Ben Menashe says no, 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 no. They knew each other way back in the 80s. So there's some interesting information out there. So I just wanted to put that on the table, and so we do not forget this, right? And this then also fits into what has come out, and a lot of this stuff is just sort of getting sort of forgotten about. But the man who is in charge of, I believe, the army aspect of the communications at Mar-a-Lago for Trump was found guilty, I believe, of lying about putting child porn on some type of Russian websites while he was working at Mar-a-Lago in relationship to Army intelligence communications. And this is like in the realm of the 2017. So there is just a whole lot going on that in relationship to this more front and center issue of the Ukraine call and the networks surrounding all of that. We're going to have to just sort of note and try to return to. So let's try to trace down some of what this Ukraine connection really is, and what Rudy Giuliani was doing, because this, of course, this does fit very much back into the historical context that we've been tracing on the antidote for much of this Trump administration's history, that has to do a lot with what was covered in Robert Friedman's book, The Red Mafia, how the Russian mob has invaded America. The whole last pages in there that really deal in a focused fashion with the relationship to Israel. There's also the question of the Ukrainian oligarchs and different loyalties and in relationship, and sort of in some kind of axis, this Russian-Israeli axis. And then, of course, there's Giuliani, once again, at the epicenter of all of this, and it traces back to the kind of things that you've pointed out a lot, Greg, about Giuliani's role as basically helping roll up the Italian mob on behalf, apparently, of the Russian-Israeli global mob.
Yeah, and so, as I mentioned before, I think that this is going to be. We have some documents, a few articles, maybe some book excerpts to read from. So at this, and just from, rather than trying to make sense of everything that's coming out right now and getting the specifics down of the current nature of what exactly is currently going on, I think just more from a little bit of a deeper dive in this show. And so I know that you have a few things up ready to read from. Do you want? What would you like to start with this? And as we go along, I'll comment as we go along when things come up or when I feel ready to chime in. So, but where would you like to? Do you have something you'd like to start from for our? I think this is going to take up majority of the rest of the show. Is there anywhere you'd like to start?
Yes, and let's start on the current with a couple Twitter threads, and
Sure.
then move into the background of and I'll read from some of Red Mafia again in relationship to some of that background. But I did pull up the specifics of that story that I just referenced, and this is actually Miami Herald from September 27th, 2019. Prosecutors, Army official at Mar-a-Lago uploaded suspected child porn to Russian website. I'm going to quote, a military official formerly in charge of all White House communications for the U.S. Army at Mar-a-Lago was sentenced to 3 years of probation on Friday after he made false statements to a federal agent during a child pornography investigation. Richard Ciccarella, a non-commissioned officer who told federal agents he was in charge of communications at President Donald Trump's Palm Beach resort, became a target of an investigation after he uploaded photos of a young girl to a seedy Russian website between 2017 and 2018, according to court documents. Ciccarella used the username RICH25N to upload suspicious photographs and folders to the website imgsrc.ru between November 2017 and February 2018, according to court documents. Okay, so that is very shady at the very least. And then, so let's hop into this question of what was going on in Ukraine, right? So a lot of this hinges around the question of corruption, right? Who's corrupt, right? And then of course a lot of this has to do with Trump apparently trying to push on the Ukraine's new president. I think he's a president, right, rather than a prime minister, Greg Zelensky.
Zelensky, I believe so.
To open up investigations in Ukraine to Biden family potential corruption there, right? And then the question becomes that in relationship to what was being focused on in relationship to the Mueller investigation and Trump Russia, that this had to do that the main issue at hand in relationship to the 2016 elections was some aspect of collusion or the seeking of Russian help by Trump people. And so that's sort of what comes into focus here, is that it appears that Trump is utilizing funding or the withholding of military aid funding to Ukraine in relationship to suggesting in a sort of mob-like fashion to Zelensky to help Trump out by digging up the dirt on Biden, or maybe constructing certain aspects of it. It's hard to know exactly.
And real quickly on this topic, as far as the media shaping of this narrative goes, particularly with the right-wing media, James Risen, formerly of the New York Times, now at The Intercept, wrote an article for The Intercept on September 25th titled, "I wrote about the Biden and Ukraine years ago," and then the right-wing spin machine turned the story upside down, and he has done a subsequent interview with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! About this. So for at least somewhat of a understanding of the way that, and just like in so many other ways, like the right-wing media will take these stories and will, whether it comes to just typical cases of corruption or whether it's the more conspiratorial type of more troublesome types of, as it relates to sexual criminality, it's just another classic example of how, like, the right-wing media will take some legitimate reporting and then will just completely turn it on its face to fit a certain narrative. And that is really no different in this case. And that James Risen, in his article in his Democracy Now! Interview, goes into this and how his initial reporting was very much been twisted and turned into something that is really not what it originally was. And so there's a deliberate confusion, it seems, as to what exactly was or was not going on with Biden's and the Democrat establishment angle of this whole Ukraine scandal.
Yeah, and it does look like the realpolitik of this is that Trump is attempting to muddy the waters so that he and Biden can get into the swamp together in a way, sort of push Biden push Biden into muddy waters so that the muddiness of Trump's background can be sort of taken off the table by basically implying, well, we're both dirty, so who's more of the America, make
and
America
another
great
aspect
again.
of this, I think we talked about this during when we were discussing the Democrat primaries on one of our previous shows, is that you've had the takedown already of like the Clintons and the Bushes. Really, I mean, just so many ways that, like, both of those families are pretty much done as political dynasties, I think, as far as really getting into higher office. And now the whole Biden thing, this just seems to be another example of another takedown of another long-term establishment politician. So, like, the establishment as we know it is becoming more and more obsolete, more and more discredited. And I think this whole thing with Biden might be another example of that when you combine this with a lot of the other reporting and controversy surrounding Biden and his record on things in the past. So that's also, in a way, this is kind of maybe almost because we've never seen Biden as the final candidate. I don't think, and so this is another element of that possible orchestrated takedown. It seems of of what we've known as like the dynasty establishment style politicians that have been in power in DC for so long. So that's also another angle of this possibly.
And I did notice that there, uh, I think it was PBS. It was David Brooks, and I forget who his
Shields,
Mark
Shields.
Shields.
Yes, yes.
It was
Talk
very
about establishment swamp dwellers. Anyway, go ahead.
And what I noticed was there was a difference between them in terms of their approach. And of course, they're there to sort of have differences to some extent, but this difference was marked. And I saw David Brooks very nervous seeming around this impeachment inquiry. And he thought it was a really bad decision and the Democrats shouldn't go there. And Mark Shields was so convinced that this was one of the most impeachable moments in American history. And so I began to think, and I also saw Rahm Emanuel sort of playing a very specific sort of like, telling the Democrats exactly what they need to focus on. They need to keep this really buttoned up and tight. And so
interesting when you consider who Rahm Emanuel's brother is. But
who David Brooks' son, who I believe served in the IDF, is. And so that's exactly what came into my mind is what you're talking about.
I think David Brooks, he's like one of those, he seems to me to be more of like maybe a neocon that's in that American, what we talked about last week with that Robert Kagan article. That seemed to me, at least on the surface, to be what his politics are. So it'd be interesting to see what his motivations would be for being kind of nervous around the whole impeachment inquiry. What kind of doors does that open up for someone like him? Who knows? But,
well, I guess what I was suggesting is that it's that people with very strong ties to Israel, to the Israeli Defense Forces, such as Rahm Emanuel
That's a great
and
point.
David Brooks, I believe David Brooks' son served there, seem to be, there's a little concern there in a way that seems different from the sort of the American establishment types who are like, this is, obviously needs to be dealt with in relationship to an assault on the national security apparatus and the Constitution and the rule of law and the Emoluments Clause.
They're ready to quote Rashida Tlaib. Maybe the only thing they agree on is they're ready to impeach the MFer, but these other people, as you're pointing out, you're a little more hesitant to.
Well, so that makes me think that we should then delve into the aspects here that connect this axis. And we might run out of time before we mention, but I just want to mention that there's this Ukrainian oligarch, Kolomoisky, who seems to be deep in the mix in relationship to the Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky. He seems to be one of the bigger backers of Zelensky, who I guess Ukraine has dual citizenship or dual passport, anti-dual citizenship or dual passport laws. And so Kolomoisky apparently has defeated that by having 3 passports, which you can really, I think our listeners would very likely anticipate: Ukrainian, Cypriot, right? Of course, and Israeli, right? And what's interesting about Kolomoisky too, and you see some of this also in relationship to even people like Vexelberg and Abramovich, is that there's an American connection there too. And Kolomoisky is deeply involved in which city? Cleveland, Ohio, of all places, and deeply involved in real estate there. And we of course have seen aspects of what the Kentucky, right, in terms of Moscow Mitch and Rand Paul in relationship to their inability to see any kind of Russian collusion of any sort, and relationship to Russian oligarchs being welcomed in and given the red carpet treatment to come in. And
you'd expect that out of Rand Paul, but not out of Mitch McConnell.
You're right. So this is a very strange time when you think about the history of the Cold War and the Republicans as seen as the sort of hard-nosed anti-communists. And then here they are, seemingly teamed up with the what some people can see as some type of continuity of the Russian deep state. And this is some of the threads that we've been dealing with in relationship to Robert Maxwell and Mogilevich, and what they were setting up really was the banking, the global banking operations, the global money laundering operations for the then Soviet and then eventually Russian deep state's continuity, which includes, of course, what is the deep state? The national security apparatus in relationship to organized criminal economics, the black economy, the black underworld, right? And so that obviously is still going on, and it turns out that it's the party that was seen as the hard-nosed national security realists of the Cold War who were so anti-Soviet, and yet they are deeply in bed with the continuity of this very similar deep state. And, so we're going to have to.
Makes you wonder with all of the, what we're seeing with the China and Israel's relationship about the very similar style of what was going on with the in terms of the rhetoric against the Soviets in the 80s that we're seeing play out with China now. That's another story for another time, but it just reminds me that it's very much that same clique, the same people that are very much now that are leading the charge against China. So it makes you wonder what the dynamics are with that relationship and what's true and what's not.
So let's wade directly into what's going on here. And of course, the whistleblower complaint mentions Rudy Giuliani as key to this. Rudy Giuliani acting as Trump, the president's lawyer. There's a question of whether how is the State Department involved? Was all this sanctioned? And that, of course, is the serious corruption question about all of this, is whether Trump was utilizing the both the assets and the interests of the U.S. The United States government on behalf of his own political interests in a very direct and corrupt fashion. Of course, that's the question at hand, and the question in relationship to the Bidens, and of course the Trump supporters want to sort of smear this as all the same in some ways. It looks like, if you go back to what you mentioned in terms of James Risen's work, that he said was pointing out a question of grift. It looked like it was a sort of a grift question, but it wasn't necessarily an illegal corruption question. And when Biden went in and applied pressure, it was apparently actually that it really was the policy of it was the policy of the American government. It was the policy that was being encouraged by many aspects of the United States allies in Europe. And so it was not the case that it was Biden on his own trying to pressure Ukrainian prosecutors or Ukrainian officials to drop prosecutors on only behalf of his own personal and political interests. He was actually, it looks like he was doing what he was told to do. This operation appears to be some type of parallel, an off-the-shelf, an off-books type of operation that's sort of semi-state sponsored. And of course, Rudy Giuliani in the middle of all of this really tells you what's going on. So let's dive into this, because we did cover little aspects of this. People can go back to our antidote about what had leaked about the Kushner Middle East economic quote-unquote peace plan, and we covered 5 minutes about how it was Giuliani was reported to have a network of 3 specific individuals that he was meeting with and working with in Ukraine. And one of them was this highly dubious character of Vadim Rabinovich, who shows up in Red Mafia by Robert Friedman, and who had been jailed for graft and was apparently actually became a made man of the KGB when he was in prison for one of these longer terms that he served. Okay, so that's the question here. So let's delve into this. On Craig Unger's Twitter thread from a little week and a half ago, it says, number 1, worth noting that Giuliani emissary to Ukraine is none other than Semyon Kislin, a contributor to Giuliani's mayoral campaign in the 90s. And it links to a story at 112.international. Sam Kislin arrives in Ukraine In 2018, Sam Kislin was banned from entry to Ukraine due to the, quote, necessity to protect the economic interests of the country. Then down in the thread, Brian Friedenborg says, thanks for posting this, Craig. You can see my own exploration from last year on Giuliani's Kislin connection here. And Real Context News, Giuliani's Kislin connection raises issues for his role as Trump's lawyer. Then Paulie Tsai at DC Paul, P-O-L-L, says, wow, as I'm sure you already know, Craig, Kislin bailed out a desperate Trump in 2001 by issuing mortgages to Russian buyers for multi-million-dollar apartments in Trump World Tower. These were the only loans Kislin ever made in New York. Okay, and then it connects to a thread that she had posted back in 2017, and that reads, Kislin Russian mob bailed Trump out in 2001 by issuing mortgages to Russian buyers of Trump World Tower, former business partner Tamir Sapir. And then it says, it links to an article in which it says, quote, Sam Kislin, a Ukrainian immigrant, issued mortgages to buyers of multi-million-dollar apartments in World Tower. It's highly unusual for individuals to issue formal mortgages for U.S. luxury real estate, and the tower loans are the only ones Kislin ever made in New York, public records show. And then one more piece of that, it talks about how Tamir Sapir died in 2014. Then it said, at Trump World Tower, Kislin provided a mortgage to Vasily Saligyan, a future official of the Ukrainian Party of Regions linked to Russian President Vladimir Putin, to buy an 83rd floor apartment. Saligyan's time in office overlapped with Paul Manafort's tenure as an advisor to the party. Manafort later served as Trump's campaign manager before his Russian links led to growing criticism and his resignation. And then I just want to delve a little bit more deeply into the current question of Giuliani in Ukraine, and then we'll go back to Red Mafia for a little bit more historical context of Rabinovich and Kislin and Giuliani, and how some of this all ties in relationship to corruption of the Democratic Party, and of course Israel is right there in the mix too. Okay, but from Olga Lautman's Twitter thread from just yesterday, September 29th, 2019, it says, a very concerning story was floating around Ukraine about Giuliani operation to get Biden info. Allegedly, a meet was supposed to take place between Ukrainian oligarch Kolomoisky, Kislin on behalf of Trump Giuliani, August 16th in Kiev, with Netanyahu as guarantor that the deal goes through. And continuing the thread, allegedly Kislin arrived in Kiev last month with two intentions: help Trump get dirt on Biden, make sure criminal cases are opened on Poroshenko in Ukraine and U.S. Kislin also met with Ukrainian intel head Bakanov. Kislin has a long relationship with Trump since '76 and with Giuliani since the '80s. Okay, and aside here, Bakanov, I believe, is a close friend, longtime friend of Zelensky, actually. And what's interesting that we'll have to put aside for now is to look at the background of Zelensky, who is, I believe, the first Jewish leader in Ukraine. He has a background in the media and TV, in acting and producing shows. And so the interesting thing that people should go look at is, okay, who owned the media assets that he, the platforms that he participated on, that he utilized for his media work for many, many, many years. And I believe one of the former heads of Ukrainian secret services, I think it's Kordovoisky or something like that. I don't have the name in front of me immediately. But he is also a billionaire, and he was involved in some of these media assets. So we'll put some links in around that, and then eventually people like Dmitry Firtash and I think it's known as the Dmitry Firtash Group, DMG, eventually takes over large aspects of the assets of these media organizations, which are also very tied into Russian media. Okay. So that I think people might want to go just look at the background there. And then finally, in terms of Zelensky as a character, he's sort of a Trumpish kind of figure for Ukraine in that he's comes from the media, he comes from TV. He played the role, I believe, in some kind of TV series or movie where he became the prime minister of or the president of Ukraine based on calling out corruption or something like that. So it feels very Surkovian, we might call it, in terms of the surrealistic aspect of hyper normalization of the merging of media narratives into real politics, and the question of using the narrative of calling out corruption to bring people to power and keep them there, i.e., hybrid warfare.
Kind of similar to Trump calling out quote unquote corruption by making a huge deal out of a birth certificate, right? But I was gonna say with relation to, you mentioned of course Israel, and obviously Giuliani's well documented close relationship with Israel and this whole Ukraine drama, and obviously the serious Israeli Russian factors when it comes to a lot of this, so much of this organized crime that we're talking about, as we're going to lay out from Red Mafia here in a few minutes, that Giuliani himself has said not to have been in Kiev, but that he met with a close aide of Zelensky's in Madrid in August. But interestingly, regarding Netanyahu visited Kiev from August 18th through August 20th, and he was the first foreign leader to visit Zelensky since his election. So no, there's nothing concrete there that can really be taken any further as far as that on its face in and of itself. But it's interesting, and it would have been interesting to have known the nature and maybe what kind of private meetings, if any, went on. And in that regard, it's interesting that you have this scandal break out, and it's really been fuming for months. It's been the seeds for this have been planted for months in ways that I guess we weren't paying enough attention as far as like the seeds being planted for this. What we're seeing now with this big scandal for several months now. But in the midst of all of this, Netanyahu makes a 3-day visit to Kiev. So don't know if that means anything, but it's interesting, and it'll be interesting to know the nature of that and the kinds of people that were involved in meetings that went on there. So just throwing that out there.
Yes. And continuing on with this Olga Lotman thread, Kislin also met with Ukrainian intel head Bakanov. Kislin has a long relationship with Trump since '76 and with Giuliani since the '80s. Kolomoisky, on his part, wants to have the money laundering investigation dropped in the U.S. and has been working with the corrupt prosecutor Shokin, who would provide the fabricated info. Keep seeing a selling price of $100 million. Netanyahu was in Kiev during that time frame. And so it's interesting, too, and aside now, that this prosecutor Shokin, right, that they're calling a corrupt prosecutor, he now is being has had a statement solicited from Dmitry Firtash's new lawyers, who I believe are both Joseph DeGeneva and his wife Victoria Tenzing. Is that how you say her name, Greg?
Hold on. I believe so. I believe it is Tenzing. That would be the closest I could come to it. And Victoria Tenzing and Joe DeGeneva are very interesting. And the Victoria Tenzing was an attorney for Scooter Libby, and both Tenzing and DeGeneva were urging Trump to get Libby pardoned, while also, but interestingly, DeGeneva, as a prosecutor, helped prosecute Jonathan Pollard and has been very vocal against his release. But we can get into DeGeneva and Tenzing maybe another time. But their whole history is interesting, as they're very much big players in this whole, from a legal perspective, in this whole deep state drama that's playing out here with Trump and some of the foreign nature of what we're seeing going on here, in various cover-ups and various narratives being shaped within the pro-Trump portion of the media landscape.
Yes, and let me just sort of clean up and clarify a few references here. I referred to the former head of the Ukrainian Secret Services, who had also been involved in media ownership, and his name is Valery Koroshkovsky. And from his Wikipedia page, it says he's a Ukrainian businessman, former head of the security service of Ukraine, former minister of finance, and former first vice prime minister. According to Ukrainian and East European media, Koroshkovsky is one of Ukraine's richest people. Okay, so it of course started in metal trading, right? So we're once again we're dealing with these mineral and material oligarchs, and then the reference I was making to the media, I will go down on his Wikipedia page here and quote, in 2005, Koroshkovsky paid about $250 million for a 61% stake in Inter TV, one of Ukraine's biggest television channels. In June 2007, he expanded his UA Intermedia Group Limited with various other channels bought from Dmytro Firtash. After Koroshkovsky was appointed as head of the State Customs Service of Ukraine in December 2007, his wife became head of UA Intermedia Group. And then Koroshkovsky sold 100% of Intermedia Group Limited back to Firtash on February 1st of 2013. Okay, so this is sort of like a circle that keeps it's a spiral in many ways, right? And of course, these are mineral and energy interests that are always in the mix here. Think even back to who George Papadopoulos, who was seen as as having links into the energy industry, specifically around Israel. And okay, and then another reference that I just wanted to clean up a little bit here was the question of Kolomoisky in Cleveland, and I'm quoting from Cleveland.com from April 8th, 2019. Ukrainian oligarch with ties to downtown Cleveland real estate under FBI investigation. Quote, federal prosecutors and agents are investigating a Ukrainian oligarch with business ties to real estate in Cleveland and a now shuttered steel mill in the Mahoning Valley. The Daily Beast reported that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Northern Ohio and the FBI are involved in a wide-ranging probe that involves Ihor Kolomoisky, I think it's Igor, and whether he committed financial crimes, including money laundering. It bases the assertion on 3 people briefed on the investigation and said the investigation has been underway for some time. The Daily Beast reported that sources said Kolomoisky was under investigation in Ohio as he has business ties here. Kolomoisky is a principal of the Privat Group, a large Ukrainian business group. Principals of the company are also part of Optima, a conglomerate of companies in the United States that has interests in real estate in Cleveland, including the One Cleveland Center building on East 9th Street and 55th Public Square. Okay, so that's it for there, but it's very interesting, this Ohio connection back here, and one wonders what the Wexner network thinks, or is what their involvement is in all of that, and what they think about this Russian-Israeli axis that's so obvious. So we'll link to all these stories and the Shokin statement that apparently tries to tie Biden to Firtash, and I don't know the truth content of that, so that's interesting. Is it gray propaganda? Is it black propaganda? We don't know. We do know that it was in the wake, really, of this coming scandal around this Ukraine call that it looks like that Dijanova and Tenzing became the lawyers for Firtash and solicited this statement. Okay. So that is sort of interesting, I think. So back to finishing up Olga Lotman's Twitter thread, and then we'll move to Red Mafia. Quote, the Netanyahu part threw me off, but one outlet, it didn't, by the way, it didn't throw us off. But one outlet played this case out. Again, it's a rumored meet that was supposed to take place, and hopefully people will dig into it a bit more. And it's connected to, I'm just going to read, these seem like they're notes of some sort. What is Netanyahu to do in Kiev? Visit with Zelensky event in Baba Yar. To help organize a meeting between Zelensky and Putin, September 7th. VV, is that Vladimir Vladimirovich? I don't know. Will fly to Israel to participate in the opening of the memorial in memory of the siege of Leningrad. Yes, I think that's true, actually. To hear in your address eulogies from Zelensky, who signed a free trade agreement with Israel, since early elections to the Knesset are scheduled for September 17th. And then finally, meet with Kolomoisky, whom he had already helped in the Royal Court of London on Privatbank, and contribute to the promotion of Minsk agreements without the participation of Medvedchuk. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, especially if you factor in the question of the now completed Israeli elections that are still in the mix here. It looked like Netanyahu was out for a while, and now it looks like he's being given the chance by the Israeli president Rivlin to actually lead the way in creating a coalition government, and whether he'll be able to do that or not, and whether it be Benny Gantz back at the table there. Of course, these are both war criminals. And but their question about how whether Israeli politics are shaking up a bit in relationship specifically to just this Netanyahu network is still on the table, and is probably part of the mix of all of this. All right, so let me get into a little bit of. We just have about 13 minutes left, but let me read a little bit from Red Mafia, unless Greg, you have any comments you want to make right now.
Yeah, what you mentioned there, it's interesting also, in just thinking between Kislin arriving in Ukraine and even Netanyahu, just makes you wonder if there's something there, and even, but it's a lot of what you mentioned there is very interesting. The Ohio connection, and a lot of major player names could be brought up in this, and so just once again, it's going to be very interesting to see where all of this heads. But I would like to know if there was a bit of a convergence or a coming together as far as the timing of all of these various people. Giuliani not going to Kiev, but going to Madrid to meet with the top Zelensky aide, and then Sam Kislin arriving in Kiev and Netanyahu being there. I don't know, but I'm just really wondering if there's something to that. But we'll see what gets revealed as time goes on here. But I'm glad we're able to find these very small Twitter threads. And while you were reading there, Jeremy, I actually reached out on Twitter, sent a message to Olga Lautman asking if Kislin was in Kiev at the same time Netanyahu was in August. So let's see if she responds to that.
Interesting. Nice. I like the follow-up. Okay, so there is this whole piece that I believe that I read actually during the quick 5-minute coverage we gave to Giuliani and his Ukrainian contacts, which included Rabinovich. That's pages, in the realm of page 266 and 267, and the run up into that of Red Mafia. And I just want to point out, it's interesting on page 267 that I'm just going to read this one paragraph here. Quote, "It was only a matter of time before the Russian mob tried to buy its way into the American political system that has contributed to it so generously, if inadvertently. In New York, for instance, they almost succeeded. The invitations had been mailed, the menu prepared, and everything had been arranged down to the last detail for a $300 per couple black tie fundraiser for then-Governor Mario Cuomo on October 10th, 1994, at Rasputin, the garish nightclub then owned by Monia Elson and the Zilber brothers. But on the eve of the event, the Cuomo campaign canceled." Okay, I just want to point out that this Rasputin is infamous in relationship to being an epicenter of Russian organized crime in New York City. But this Monia Elson, not only seen as a key partner or maybe more a lieutenant of Semyon Mogilevich, but Monia Elson, I believe I pointed out before, I think this is true, also comes from Moldova, and the same town in Moldova as Avigdor Lieberman did. And it's interesting, too, thinking about, like we pointed out before, Avigdor Lieberman is in the same way that the background of Benjamin Netanyahu is as a furniture salesman before he gets involved in things like, Boston Financial and the Mitt Romney group like that, that he was a furniture salesman, just like Lieberman was. Avigdor Lieberman was a bouncer at a nightclub in Moldova, and so it's interesting. Monia Elson owning a nightclub, right? So a key place, of course, in terms of mob operations. But the other thing that I pointed out is that though Monia Elson, I believe, is maybe 10 years older than Lieberman, they both left, I think, the exact same year, either 78 or 79, from their town in Moldova, and Lieberman makes Aliyah to Israel, becomes a key politician for many years there, serving many different positions, while also being a suspected, agent of then Soviet, then now Russian intelligence in the mix there. And while Elson is setting out for the United States of America, while obviously setting up an epicenter in New York City. So I think that's sort of interesting. And then I'm going to skip through a lot. It talks about...
Real quick, you mentioned the Lieberman in Moldova and the Russian connections with Lieberman. I just earlier this week, Times of Israel published an interview with an expert on oligarchs by the name of Ilya Zaslavsky, who is the Washington-based head of research at the Free Russia Foundation. And the basic gist of the article is that there's all kinds of money from what Zaslavsky refers to as kleptocratic governments, particularly Russia, zeroing in on Russia, among others, that are going into many different countries and influencing their politics, including Israel. And at one point, Zaslavsky mentions that a lot of Russians will go into Israel and will even get into areas of or will not publicly discuss their Russian the Russian nature of what they're involved in, as far as just not cloaking the Russian aspects of the work they're doing and their activism and what they're involved in. And it reminded me of what we talked about before, Robert Friedman's article on high-level KGB within the Israeli establishment. So I was thinking about that again with Lieberman and what you brought up there.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to rush through a few minutes of some of this information in Red Mafia. Page 268, after talking about Luchansky and calling him a Latvian-born convicted felon and president of the Austrian-based Nordex, a multinational trading company that had been implicated in everything from he had been implicated in everything from major money laundering to smuggling nuclear components. Remember that aspect of what we were covering from Seeds of Fire and the U.S. intelligence community's concern about the connection of smuggling nuclear components between the Russian mob and Israeli security state in the middle of Europe, actually, right? So there's that. And then on page 268, quote, in July 1995, the DNC invited the mobster, talking about Luchansky, to a $25,000 a plate fundraising dinner for Clinton at the Hay Adams Hotel in Washington. At the last minute, the security services provided information on Luchansky, and the State Department denied him a visa, which he had obtained in Israel. He was subsequently banned from entering the United States, Canada, Hong Kong, and England. By the way, there's a big security services spy scandal in Canada, in the heart of the highest levels of the RCMP, the Royal Mounties, and their apparent major penetration at the highest levels of their counterintelligence and cyber operations. But we'll have to put that aside. Maybe we can put in a link to that, and that's been going down and sort of been washed out of the media at the same time. So back to the text here on page 268 of Red Mafia. Quote, the mobsters were not easily dissuaded, however. In September 1995, not long after the Luchansky ban, his partner at Nordex, Ukrainian mob boss Vadim Rabinovich, an aside, right, like Giuliani's contact in Ukraine, one of his major contacts in Ukraine via his guy Kislin, it looks like, attended. Actually, this was before when it was actually Giuliani going directly to Ukraine, right? So there's lots of operations running concomitantly. Okay, back to the text. Vadim Rabinovich attended a Clinton Gore fundraiser at the Sheraton Bell Harbor Hotel in Miami. Rabinovich came as a guest of Bennett S. LeBeau, the chairman of Brook Group Limited, parent of Liggett, a cigarette manufacturing company. LeBeau refused to comment. Rabinovich, who buys, and that of course is also the connection to Howard Lorber, and we've talked about that before. Back to the text. Rabinovich, by his own account, once served an 8-year jail term in Ukraine for theft of state goods, should not have ever been in the United States, let alone attending a gala for the president. Okay, and that, of course, is what I referenced in terms of it's been stated that was the time when he became, an asset of Soviet intelligence. Then skipping ahead to just wrap up with Kislin in the book, page 270 at the bottom. Quote, by the dawn of the new millennium, Russian mobsters were lavishing millions of dollars in contributions on Democratic and Republican politicians. In New York City, commodities mogul and alleged wise guy Semyon Sam Kislin has been one of Mayor Rudy Giuliani's top campaign supporters. Kislin, various relatives, and his companies raised or donated a total of $64,950 to Giuliani's mayoral campaigns in 1993 and 1997. A Ukrainian immigrant well known among the Russian Jewish community in South Brooklyn, Kislin has also made generous donations to Democratic Senator Charles Schumer, as well as other state politicians. According to a confidential December 1994 FBI report and underworld sources, Kislin is a member of the Ivankov organization. These sources say that Kislin's New York commodities firm has been involved in laundering millions of dollars and co-sponsored a U.S. visa for a man named Anton Malevsky, who is a contract killer and head of one of Russia's most bloodthirsty mafia families. Kislin's donations to charities and politicians bore fruit in 1996 when he was appointed to be a member of New York City's Economic Board of Development Corporation. On December 2, 1999, Giuliani reappointed Kislin to the board, stating in a letter that his service is deeply appreciated. Kislin has denied any ties to the Russian mob, insisting at a December 1999 press conference that, quote, I have done nothing evil, unquote. Okay. So this of course is in the portion of Red Mafia that really hones in on the question of Russia and Israel, and how any high level Russian Ukrainian gangster that you can think of, they all have Israeli passports, right? And so there's a whole background there that even is very, very big, that we'll even link to a paper. It's actually more like a book called The Global Political Economy of Israel, which at the end of it actually has a whole section. This is written by Jonathan Nitzan and Shimshon Bichler, that has a whole section about the rise of the Russian oligarchs and mobsters in relationship to Israel. But we're in our last minute here. Greg, any 30-second comments?
Yeah, we'll just continue following up on a lot of the names and that we've been talking about here. It might be good here in the next couple weeks or so to do another long form show where we can even bring some more names into this. I'm thinking people like Natan Sharansky. But at the very least, this is, I guess, a kind of a basic primer into some of the people who, Rudy Giuliani is really trying to shape this Biden narrative and this Ukraine narrative, as far as who himself is just so much up to his eyeballs in Ukrainian corruption. Some of the connections that really aren't being talked about.
Thank you so much, Greg. Until next week, Antidote, we out.